Engage.
Welcome back to Reality Check Podcast, the show where we ask those obnoxious questions like, what is the real meaning of 42, and is it coincidentally the waist size of Richard Dawkins? Today we have a very special guest, somebody who has got I believe he's approaching his PhD in philosophy of mind, something which frankly is very, very attractive to us listeners, including myself. His name is Peter Sjöstedt. He is Scandinavian born and lives in Cornwall. He has been teaching in London for some time on the subject of philosophy. His book, which I've just read, is called Neo-nihilism, and it's a really, really, really interesting read, folks. The subtext is metaphysics, metaethics, and psychedelics, which Peter tells us is something we would rarely, if ever, see in combination. And this is quite a cocktail of consciousness. Let me just give you a quick insight on the back of the book here, because any attempt to kind of summarize this myself, I think, will fall short. So Peter is in the book, he traverses the mindscape of metaphysics, nihilism, psychedelic phenomenology. It navigates through subjects such as the sentience of cells, the constrictions of consciousness, the metaphysics of might, the magic of mushrooms, the narcotics of Nietzsche, and the neologicalism of neo-nihilism, the last of which may cause flashbacks. Tracing the fall of Western morality through Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, the book describes deeper still into a metaphysics further upheld by Henry Bergson and Alfred White Northhead. This collection of essays and notes provides a most idea-provoking, educational, original piece of literature for the thoughtful reader and specialist alike. And I, for one, concur. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to give Peter a chance to talk about it himself. I'm going to be a little more passive in this conversation, frankly, because this is a subject matter which I think, to be frank about it, is very specialized and quite tricky. So I'm going to do my best to shut up for this show as much as I can do. But I'm going to start with a question for Peter.
Okay.
So here's how it goes. I had somebody in my chair the other day. Incidentally, I work as a dentist, and I do occasionally have a two-way conversation as a dentist. Not to indulge myself in this. This is not my revenge on the world where I have a monologue because so no, I did have a two-way conversation, and it went something like this. I had a psychologist in, he's a theoretical psychologist for that matter, very much involved in his research and so forth, and he was telling me that, well, I suppose I was telling him about you for a start off, and he told me that he did have a philosopher of mind giving a lecture to his students recently, and that the philosopher of mind gave them three paradigms of philosophy of mind to wrestle with, and offered a little Q&A session afterwards. And the question that seemed hottest to be asked both by the lecturer and his students alike was, well, you've given us three models here, which one is correct? And of course the philosopher replied, well, that misses the point of the question. So would you like to maybe elaborate on what a philosopher might mean when they would answer that response to that question? Or would you think that there perhaps is a model of mind that one should be looking at specifically?
Well, okay. Well, I imagine those three options were probably materialism, dualism, and idealism. Is that right?
I didn't hear the specifics, although for my own 10 cents, they were the three I'd be looking at personally, yes. But maybe you could elaborate on them for us.
Okay, well, the most common paradigm of mind at the moment probably is materialism, which is a sort of Western common sense view, unless you're religious, which is simply that the mind is the brain, and every mental aspect can be reduced to neurology or physiology, which means that the universe ultimately is completely mechanical. It's governed by laws of push and pull, the four forces of nature: gravity, electromagnetism, strong weak nuclear force. But the problem that has a number of problems, which is why a number of people don't accept it. For example, this notion we have of free will. It's very hard to explain through materialism that the mind can cause the body to move in some way, because for materialism, for most materialisms at least, the mind is a product of matter. So therefore, in a funny kind of way, and there are different models, matter produces mind. It's known as epiphenomenalism. But mind can't produce matter. which means that free will is not true. It also means things such as reasoning have no causal efficacy. So when I work something out, there's really no point because, as it were, the brain's doing it anyway. But that seems counterintuitive. So some people therefore believe in dualism, which is the notion that as well as the universe being composed of matter, it's also, there's another substance, second substance in the dual, which is mind, and the mind and the body somehow interact. And so this is stems from Plato, really. Descartes, René Descartes, French philosopher, made it famous, and it's sort of, most Christians believe it. So the soul goes to heaven or wherever after death. The main problem with that, though, is the notion of interaction. How does a mental substance interact with a material substance? Because a substance is defined as something that is independent, causally independent of anything else. So therefore, how does the brain act on the mind? So, for example, if you have brain damage, why should that affect the mind in any way? And likewise, if you decide or think you decide to do something, why should that have any effect on the body? And if they do interact, it sort of suggests that, well, it's not a substance dualism, then it's some kind of monism. But most academics don't believe in dualism, but Henry Bergson's got a sort of subtle version of it, which is the most powerful that I've read. The third sort of main option is idealism. A number of different idealisms. Most famous one probably is from Kant and his transcendental idealism. Now, idealism is the view that, well, there are different types, but Kant's idealism, for example, is the view that the reality which exists independently of us, as it were, what it's made of, as it were, we don't know. So he calls this noumena. It's sort of an unknown reality. Matter is a product of our minds. So in order for us to interpret that reality, whatever it may be, our minds automatically sort of translate it into matter, into space and time, even for Kant. So for Kant, space and time are not real. They're only our particular way of looking at things. So those are the three main kind of options with regard to understanding mind. And I was, I've gone through all of them. So I was a materialism in my youth, sort of Richard Dawkins type materialist. I did play around with dualism with Bergson to a certain extent. But I sort of settled on idealism, especially the idealism of the neo-Kantian Schopenhauer. And I still have a lot of respect for that. But I've sort of, as it were, moved on now to another way of looking at things completely, which is known as process philosophy. And that's really...
So do you want to elaborate that? Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, so that process philosophy is inaugurated by Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician, then became a sort of philosopher of science, and then became a metaphysician. He died in the 1940s. Process philosophy Whitehead's becoming very popular now. When he released his stuff, it wasn't the right time because logical positivism, behaviorism was in, which is the notion that, what is, behaviorism is the view that mental states don't really exist as such, they're just behavior. So happiness really can be reduced to smiling or jumping or laughing or something like this. So this reduction to physicality ultimately, which was common in the early 20th century, wasn't conducive to Whitehead's philosophy, which came out at the time. But now he's becoming popular again, and he's such an amazing philosopher that hopefully he'll become even more popular. What is it? Well, it's the view that there are no such things as substances or things even, but everything is a process, an event. So that sounds sort of intuitive. But it has profound implications, really, for understanding mind and the universe and general metaphysics and even science. So that's what I'm currently concerned with, and my PhD is focusing on Whitehead and the notion of panpsychism, which is the view that sentience is not merely a product or identical to a brain or complex physiology, but is something which is universal throughout nature.
Yeah, well, and pardon the intrusion of the little sentient being in the room here. I've got a small cat. I say small; he's quite large, like a little rag doll. And if you hear a meowing in the background, it's not me; it is my cat.
Okay.
People who know me know I've got cats, so if there's a little intrusion, pardon me. But pansentient, certainly. Let's kind of get into that a little
Yep.
bit. So, I mean, most people will, quite comfortably accept the notion that perhaps, a cat can have sentience. Maybe let's take that to the plant world. We could argue that plants have sentience to some degree. I mean, they react to various stimuli, they respond to various environments in different ways. That implies a certain level of sentience, perhaps, although somebody might, as you would perhaps suggest, reduce that to some type of behavior mechanism. It doesn't necessarily imply anything on the level of free will. These are kind of age-old questions. At what level does sentience emerge? Where does free will emerge? Where does intellectual insight emerge, and so on? But let's kind of skip past the nitty-gritty and get back to see if we can try and tackle this at a more fundamental level. And this might be a bit of a leap. I'm not sure if you've taken the journey this far, although I expect you probably have, and taken it further perhaps. Let's take it at the level of the subatomic particle. I mean, can we imply sentience at that level, and how do we define sentience at that level? Is that something you've tackled?
Yeah, it's part of what is known as pan-experientialism, which is Whitehead's version of panpsychism. So yeah, the way to tackle that really from his point of view is the following. So you talk about, we take sentience down to maybe a cat and so on. In philosophy of mind, there's a so-called lobster limit, so you suspect that any organism more complex than a lobster, probably has sentience. Anything below it, like a fly, probably hasn't. But that's a completely arbitrary line, of course. And the beauty of Whitehead, in my eyes, is this, that he actually sees no distinction between the organic and inorganic for a start. So you can start with a human organism, go down the complexity level to a cat, then to a lobster, to a flea, but then you can go down to the cells within a flea. You can go down to the DNA molecules, which are organic molecules, of course, and before that, viruses, perhaps. Now, if you are going to call a molecule DNA organic, why not call another molecule within the body organic as well, which can exist outside the body? And if you call a molecule organic, why not an atom to subatomic particles? So the distinction that people make between, the organic and inorganic, really for Whitehead, is artificial. It's not a real distinction at all.
How does one ordinarily define this organic and organic process? I mean, I suppose organic would, for most people, would imply self-organizing, but isn't all matter self-organizing at some level? I mean, that's how I see it.
Yeah, the word for that is autopoietic, and the way that Whitehead defines subjectivities is through some level of self-sufficiency. So a number of critics of panpsychism say it's absurd to say, for example, a table or a chair is sentient, but most panpsychisms deal with that by saying that, well, a chair or a table is not an autopoietic entity. It doesn't heal itself, it doesn't grow, it doesn't reproduce, and so on. It doesn't maintain itself in any way. Whereas a cell does, and molecules do, self-replicating molecules, and atoms do, and so on. So another term for his philosophy, in fact, the term he uses himself, is the philosophy of organism. In other words, everything is an organism. But you have to differentiate organisms as such from aggregates like tables and chairs. Now, there's some gray areas like crystals, which are seemingly aggregates, but at the same time self-organizing. So that's a bit of an unknown.
You nicely quoted in your book that he describes biology as the biology was the physics. I've lost it.
I think I know
got that
what you're
quote.
talking about. He says that if I can remember now, biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms. Yeah.
Yeah, I was absolutely blown away by that idea, to be honest with you. I think that's fabulous.
Yeah. So if everything's organism, well, we know that at least in ourselves, we know that the more complex organisms are sentient. Now, but I use sentience instead of consciousness because when people use consciousness, they generally think of human consciousness, with our memories, the particular colors we see, the sounds we see, and so on, the thoughts we have. But sentience is a broader term, a more general term of awareness. which is
Right.
differentiated from matter. So it's not that he doesn't in any way suggest that cells are conscious, or in terms of having a good day or a bad day, but they are sentient.
So let's just try and dig out that word sentient a little bit. I mean, I'm on the same page as you. Incidentally, I would always distinguish between. I probably use the term awareness rather than sentient, but I think sentient probably is a little more colourful. Awareness is probably, well, I think it probably implies something similar. But let's just kind of dig out that idea between sentience and consciousness a little bit. Just define sentience a little bit more, if you can. If you can kind of just hone in on that a little bit.
Okay. Well, sentience includes what we would call the unconscious, which is something attributed to Freud. So he says that we have but it's not Freud. I mean, it goes back to Schopenhauer before him even. But we have this notion that we are conscious of things. In other words, we're focused on them, but we have an unconscious as well, which is not matter, of course, and there's not force, energy in the objective sense. So sentience would include that unconscious. What Freud, for example, calls the id, and a lot more. Now, at the moment, I'm presuming that less complex organisms have a simpler type of sentience. So, we have, the 5 traditional senses, but also more, I think. And perhaps a simple organism has only, some kind of light sensing eye, in which case its consciousness would be simpler. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that it's less intense. So you have to differentiate complexity from intensity, I think, in sentience. So even a cell, like let's say an amoeba cell, which has just devoured some food, maybe it has an intense experience of something analogous to satisfaction, not human satisfaction, something analogous to satisfaction. The intensity might be very, very high, yet the complexity would be lower. But of course, this is something which is metaphysical, because in the ordinary sense, at least, we can't test. We can't become another organism to know what it is like to be that organism. There's a famous philosophical essay called "What is it like to be a bat?" by Thomas.
Nagel, of course, yeah. But I wonder, did Nagel take the mushroom and find out, is the question. Perhaps that is the question.
That's the speculation I make in the book, as you're probably aware, then, that there might be other forms of cognition which do allow for entry into the subjectivity of another organism. Sounds crazy, but Whitehead allows for the possibility, and there are a number of psychedelic trip reports of that phenomenon. So I'm open-minded about it.
I am too. I am. I certainly am. I think it's it's something I wrestle with in my own kind of writing. I take Nagel's point of view. I still can't help to feel that we would somehow contaminate it with our own perspective, and I think perhaps the kind of transcendental ideological motif would creep in there as well. That we can't define something outside of ourselves without contaminating with our own process, and therefore any description we have of it ultimately is we have to factor in our own selves into it, and therefore is not the thing itself, if you
absolutely, yeah. So that's sort of subjective filter that we have.
But having said that, certainly we can experience it at some level, by all means. Yes.
I always make the analogy of Kant's transcendental idealism with looking at a dark room with a torch. So if you can't really see darkness, in other words reality, unless you shine a torch at it. But of course, by shining a torch at it, you're not really seeing darkness. Seeing light, and if you turn the torch off, you don't see anything. So that certainly seems to be the case if you accept that kind of transcendental idealism, which I don't fully accept, actually. But no doubt, yeah. I mean, Charles Hartshorne, one of the sort of big panpsychists of the 20th century, he said one of the reasons that people find panpsychism so difficult to digest and accept is because it's very, very hard to imagine what it's like to be something, another animal, and therefore certainly a virus or something like that. But the reason I must say that one of the reasons that panpsychism has become popular again in the last 10 years is because of something in an old problem in the philosophy of mind, which has sort of emerged again, which is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is, put basically, it's the problem that no matter how much one understands the complexity of the brain or any physiology, that by itself does not yield knowledge of the phenomenology connected to it. So, and this is related to Nagel's essay again. So let's say we look at the an octopus's brain, and we know it inside out. We understand exactly how the synapses work in relation to the whole body. And of course, 2/3 of an octopus's brain, as I like to point out, is in its arms. So it's got a very unique kind of brain. But it doesn't matter how much we look at that brain and body, it will not tell us what it's like to be that octopus. So, in other words, consciousness or sentience it seems that it cannot be fully understood. In fact, half of it can't be understood through objective means alone, through pure neuroscience. So also, it's a bit of a mystery how mind, and more importantly, really, how the mind would emerge from matter. So you've got matter working in the brain, say, in whatever way. Why should mind be connected to that in any sense whatsoever? Why should it emerge from the brain? Why isn't reality simply matter or matter energy operating without any sentience whatsoever? And this, I think, is a profound problem with physics, or not physics. Physics is a method, but the dogmatism of physics or scientism, that believing that you can know the whole of reality through physics alone. Well, it just does not explain mind. And neuroscience, as I say, doesn't explain the mind. It certainly is very useful medically and whatever, and it does explain correlations of mind, but it doesn't per se in itself explain the mind.
You used a very nice expression when you talked about a conflation of causality and correlation. I mean, it's a really nice quote, by the way.
Yeah.
A very powerful statement, to be frank about it. It's one that you can throw at the neurobiologists, and certainly it throws them off their scent a little bit. Although, to be frank about it, most neurobiologists will be the first to tell you that they don't know.
Yeah.
Is the honest answer. I mean, that's anybody who has really insight into this area will tell you that a decent scientist will be the first to tell you that they don't know.
No, I completely agree. I've got a good friend in Sweden actually who creates brain scanners, and he's the first to plead ignorance. And I'm certainly not pleading absolute knowledge either, of course. I think it's generally the case that genuine scientists they know their limits. I mean, they are they're very hesitant to assert anything really. But it's people who are not scientists, who are interested in science and have a sort of desire for certainty that breeds what can be called a scientism. That we know that the universe is this way because these experiments show it without doubt and so on.
But can we just kind of take this idea for a moment that, this idea of matter and mind, is it possible to talk about matter outside of mind? Isn't matter ultimately only, and this again is perhaps very the kind of Kantian motif again, but isn't matter only ever observed in mind, and therefore by implication ultimately to some extent a product of mind?
Yeah.
You can't talk about matter outside mind, or can you?
Well, that's certainly the idealist view, and Schopenhauer says that matter really ultimately is causality, which is a projection of our minds onto reality. And Berkeley, of course, George Berkeley, the bishop, is more radical, and he says that everything that we perceive is only in our minds, in God's mind, and that's it. Well, what the process view of that is this, that matter, and Bertrand Russell, who was, by the way, Whitehead's student, agrees. Matter is an abstraction, by which I mean it's what one has extracted away from concrete reality, an aspect of it, a part of it, and then reified that. In other words, made that into a real thing, whereas it's only a real thing as a word. So for Whitehead, then, matter is just a part of the greater reality, which includes mind in the first place. So now, why has that happened? Well, a lot of people blame Descartes for that, because he was famous for breaking the world up into mind and matter, the dualism I was speaking about. And he, by the way, only attributed consciousness to humans, not even dogs. Now, what seems to have happened historically in the West, at least, is that people sort of accepted Descartes' dualism. It was sort of intuitive, but then a number of people said, well, we've got mind on this side, matter on this side, or mechanism on this side. We'll just reject the mind part and keep the mechanism, and then try to explain how mind comes out of that mechanism later on. But of course, that hasn't happened, and logically, I think it can't happen, because you can't explain a concrete reality from an abstraction from that reality. So it's a bit like looking at a cake and extracting or abstracting from it all the colors, recreating that cake as a picture, and then thinking, now where's the flavor? Where's the flavor in this picture? I can't. It's definitely correlated, and the flavor somehow must supervene upon the canvas or something like this. But I think the whole problem, the whole reason we've gone wrong, is because we have not realized that matter in the first place was an abstraction, wasn't the concrete reality. It's just a very useful way of differentiating the world, so as to be able to put things like particles, for example, into models. We also differentiate time in terms of space, like in instants T1, T2, T3, which also I think is not quite right. And then we create models. We do successfully, to an extent, predict the future with that, and we create technology with that. So it's very, of course, no one can deny the success of science in terms of medicine, weapons, and so on, and predictions. But nonetheless, it's not a sufficient explanation. It's just a useful explanation. And so that I think the problem always is when you consider use to be truth. Once you denounce the materialist explanation, which is that all action is caused by push and pull, ultimately, then other forms of action open up before you, such as that. And of course, it sounds crazy to a lot of people, but the more I find, at least, the more you look into things, the more you realize you don't really know anything. So a lot of things become possible.
What about the notion of, let's say, the kind of shamanistic perspective that the planet is trying to speak to us through the ayahuasca, for example, being a kind of one of the more how to say, popular choices in today's age, that the planet is trying to alert us to our behavior, but through this kind of communication from the Amazon forest, and it's specifically calling us to the Amazon to have a conversation with us. I suppose it's a little bit like your behavior getting a little out of hand and your parent calling you in and saying, I need to have a conversation with you.
I mean, okay, it's possible, but I mean, another causal explanation to that could be some cultural understanding. It's like in a particular belief system. You'd interpret your experience on ayahuasca, according to these cultural norms that you've picked up somehow. That's another explanation for it. Or maybe, of course, going back, you've picked up these cultural norms due to that larger sort of godparent, as it were, speaking to you in the first place. And also another aspect is this, that maybe a sort of, what shall I say, climate change apocalypse will be a good thing for the Earth as a whole and the human race as a whole, So maybe 2/3 of us will die off, but the future will then...
Well, to bring ayahuasca into, if people can purge, the planet can purge. Maybe that's what's going to happen. Maybe the planet's going to purge.
It could be. But I mean, whatever.
Could you imagine the planet having a bad trip? What would that look like?
Well, planets do eventually...
Probably Donald Trump being president. That'd be a bad trip.
I once told my son, I've got a 5-year-old son now, but when he was about 3, I was telling him a number of sort of trivial facts, whilst brushing his teeth or whatever. And he was like, okay, yeah, interesting. And then one day I said, did you know, Arthur, that one day the sun will explode? And he looked at me and just burst into tears. And I thought, oh, that's strange. That why would you burst into tears about that? Well, really thought of that in advance. But then I was about to tell him, don't worry, because you'll be dead by then. But I didn't want to say that. I just left that and tried to move on. But yes, so
Can we pick up this idea, incidentally, that you just touched on earlier on, right there? But I do want to get into it because we're kind of coming to the kind of closing chapter, really, in terms of people's time. I don't want to take too much of their time. I think an hour is a lot to ask for from anybody, but people are gracious enough to give it to us. But this idea of what we had a little chat off earlier on there. This notion of the will to power,
mm,
Alan Nietzsche, and we were talking then about Whitehead and how he kind of used that by we didn't say by contrast, we said perhaps by the concurrence, but we want to just look at the different kind of motifs as to why there is anything and why that anything has does that anything that does exist, does it have some kind of a meaning, an agenda? Why is the universe is apparently complexifying, and it is apparently becoming, so far as I can understand, there seems to be more meaning emerging from that. Now, the Dawkins of the world, and we use them as a punch bag, we're being a little bit unfair on them, but the material scientists of the world will tell us that there is no meaning, and that this is all just an accident of chemistry, and it's just mere coincidence, and it doesn't really matter.
mm.
And
To
let's maybe address
forward
that.
to that, he says, it's amazing how many scientists um, spend their time or have a huge purpose in trying to disprove purposes. It's a sort of a performative contradiction. But okay, the first thing I'd say about Nietzsche and Whitehead is this: that I'm currently, as part of my PhD, I've got hold of Whitehead's personal copy of Nietzsche's notebooks, which is known as The Will to Power, and they're marked. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
write an essay on that soon, comparing them. Okay, what I'll say is this. So, for those who don't know, Nietzsche's notion of the will to power is central tenet of his later philosophy, and it's the notion that all actions ultimately can be reduced to a power drive. Um, Now, that's not necessarily greed, of course, because for Nietzsche, in my interpretation, there are a number of interpretations, the will to power is an immanent, an internal aspect of everything, every uh, form of matter energy, as we'd call it today. So it's really a drive for development. And with regard to what you were saying, that development means creativity to some extent. It's a drive to development. It also means, being able to oversee your environment and be able to manipulate your environment. It doesn't necessarily mean a sort of lust, a greedy lust for power, Napoleon style, although it includes that as well. So that's what the will to power is in a nutshell. I've got a video on YouTube about it. Or if you type in will to power Nietzsche, you should find it. It's about 16, 17 minutes long. Okay, how does it relate to Whitehead? Well, Nietzsche's ultimate point is that all moral systems, all our ideologies really are just unwittingly, in most cases, a form of power. So the Christian and religions likewise. So the Christian church is a power structure, as are ideologies such as Marxism, psychoanalysis even, and of course that was post-Nietzsche, and so on. Morality itself for Nietzsche, and this is what made him famous really, and this was his sort of raison d'etre, morality itself is a power structure. And so we think as well as inheriting this view of mechanism from Descartes and Plato, or dualism from Plato and so on, we also inherit from Christianity, at least in the West, this notion that there is a morality, and then we think, well, how can we sanction this? How can we justify this? So Kant, came up with this huge deontological theory, and Mill has this utilitarian theory, and there were all these competing ethical theories, But Nietzsche says, look, instead of asking how do we sanction morality, we should really question whether there is an objective, absolute morality to sanction. In fact, he goes further and says this morality, which we keep looking for the roots, is in fact just a power structure, and we can trace its origins back to the Roman age, and the Christians that emerged at that time. They were the slaves of the Romans, and they instead of having what Nietzsche called a master morality of valuing valor, strength, courage, and so on, beauty, they valued the opposite. So they valued compassion, pity, humility, and things like this. And this was, of course, an alternate system which was used as a power structure to overcome the Roman Empire from that what he considers a lower perspective, and it became dominant. Constantine, of course, converted to Christianity in I think 312 AD, and then we've got, the rest is history, as it were. So
Hmm.
we've been so entrenched in the West in this Christian ideology that even those of us who call ourselves atheists still inherit this Christian ideology, and we still think like, well, look, compassion is a good thing, for example, pity is a good thing. Now, how do we prove that? Is it, the utility principle or whatever? Nietzsche was saying, look, there are other moral systems out there, um, and we shouldn't just assume that one moral system is right. Ultimately, all these moral systems, including the one you might create for yourself, is a power system. In other words, it helps you. And it helps, when I say you, that could include your family unit or your society, but ultimately you. So that's why one of his later books is called Beyond Good and Evil, because he wants to interpret the world beyond those concepts of good and evil, which he thinks is like sin and virtue. We don't say today things are sinful, but likewise, he says we shouldn't call things evil for the same sense, by the same principle. Um, so it's pretty harsh, but it does allow you to see the world in a completely different perspective, and it's very, it's very influential, and it can be used in in dangerous ways, as it has. But how does it tie in with Whitehead? Well, so in the later Nachlass, in the notebooks of Nietzsche, he talks about the will to power, especially in some published works like Beyond Good and Evil, section 36. He talks about the will to power as an inner effect, an affect form in German. In other words, um, all of what we call matter energy then is, in its internal aspect, a striving for development, for creativity, you could say. And this then is manifested in terms of an organism, a cell, a human, and a society, an ideology, a morality, whatever. It's all ultimately reducible to the same thing. That's why it's sort of an attractive theory, because it explains everything by the same principle. Not that that means it's right, therefore, but it's got aesthetic charm, and it follows the principle of parsimony, Occam's razor. So this internal striving, of which matter is an abstraction, is very similar, I think, to the actual entities that Whitehead speaks of, and specifically their what Whitehead calls their subjective aims. So an actual entity for Whitehead is the ultimate unit of reality. It's a moment, it's a drop of experience. It's an occasion. It comes into being and it passes rapidly. An electron is a society of these actual entities, for example. But these entities have subjective aims. In other words, a telos, a purpose, a striving to maintain itself. And thus there is an overlap between Whitehead and Nietzsche there, this inner striving, which is something I'm currently working on and trying to harmonize.
So I can see the Darwinists hijacking this and talking about it being just picking up on that word survival there, and again the kind of mechanistic view starting to creep in and consolidate that, and perhaps misinterpret it. For me, just to kind of give you my own 10 cents in it, and perhaps you can maybe see how you reflect on that. For me, the motif is a kind of a gnosis, that the cosmos ultimately is in effect trying to understand itself in a richer, more complex way, and that all these strives are ultimately towards a kind of a metanosis, so to speak. And this is concurrent, incidentally, with Whitehead's motif and perhaps to some extent to Nietzsche's. But for where I see power kind of to some extent, and again, I don't really understand Nietzsche's philosophy to the degree that I can criticize it, but it feels to me that there's a sense of individualism there. I see a kind of a more of a holism, and that ultimately it's more of a symbiosis than it is this kind of survival of the fittest, so to speak. It's more of a kind of a survival of the most symbiotic. And I'm looking at this, partly from a metaphysical perspective, partly from my own human perspective, but also from a biological perspective. The example I often give, and I talk about it in terms of biology, is the folks of Easter Island, who were erecting these heads to their gods that they created, and in the process ended up cutting all the trees down and actually killing themselves. If you never heard that moral story, it's a great one. It's the idea basically that if you take too much from the land, if you take too much from your environment without giving back, ultimately, the parasite kills the organism despite itself, so to speak. So in that regard, when something strives for power without perspective to its impact on everything else, ultimately it can compromise itself. Now, from what you're saying there about Nietzsche, Nietzsche seems to be, as you said, talks about manipulating the environment and so on. So I think, as you said, that there seems to be a kind of a multidimensional perspective beyond the individual to recognize the impact of their actions on everything else. But that still comes down to a kind of a holism for me, and it comes back to a very Buddhist kind of essay.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily incompatible because a symbiotic unity can be identified as a sort of self-sufficient form of the will to power. That's just my telephone. I'll leave it.
That's fine.
Um, yeah. So I mean, like Nietzsche talks, even the human individual for Nietzsche is a multiplicity of wills to power. So there's not just
Hmm.
one there. There's a symbiotic relationship. I mean, all the organs are working together, and cells and whatever. So, but for Nietzsche, there's a dominating will to power, which is also something you find in Leibniz, what something he calls a dominant monad, Spinoza, Conatus, and so on, and in Whitehead as well, which is manifests as the brain, central organism of control. Um, so I mean, the will to power certainly does work in symbiosis. It has to really. Um, so, but still, those symbiotic units do compete for each other. Of course,
Hmm.
when you look at the history of evolution, we realize, I think, it's estimated that over 99% of the species that have evolved have gone extinct. So most
Hmm.
often these power. I'm talking about Easter Island there. I mean, most of these units, these pushes for power are unsuccessful ultimately. But nonetheless, I think they are part of the universe. We must sort of accept
Hmm.
that this grab for power, in most cases unconsciously, even people who are protesting against, corporate greed or something are still, manifesting their own sense of power. They would rather the
Hmm.
world was in a different state according to their own subjective preferences and so on.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, if
Is it perhaps even a competition of, if we take this kind of idea of transcendental idealism, is there perhaps a suggestion that it is competitive ideology, that ideology itself, that there's a kind of a subjective ideological competition going on, that because there is no fundamental meaning, that meaning itself is competing with itself, perhaps?
um, Yeah, I mean, I
Don't know.
certainly say that ideologies compete, meaning competing with itself. I mean, yeah, meaning of life certainly is competing with itself. I mean, if you don't believe that, you'd have to believe that there's an absolute standard, correct way of living, which
Hmm.
I think when people really think about that, for a start, it's very, very hard to sanction that, to logically justify that that exists. It would be something like a Platonic form of the good. There exists
Hmm.
transcendentally this standard, this ideal
Hmm.
we should all move. But of course, even looking at the history of Britain itself, these ideals themselves are in flux, just as I think the laws of nature are in flux, or potentially in flux. So I think moral ideals are in flux. I mean, for example, homosexuality was illegal 50 years ago in Britain, and now homophobia is more or less illegal. And in 50 years' time, who knows what will be illegal? Maybe things we don't think twice about will be illegal.
That's a great way of putting it. That's a very sharp line, that is. I gotta hand it to you.
So I think ultimately, if you want to really push process philosophy to its maximum, which I strive to do, you're going to have
Hmm.
to not only think that material things don't exist but are in flux, but also moral ideals are in flux. And once you do that, you look at the world in a completely new light. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's a form of nihilism, what I call neo-nihilism. Doesn't mean you want to go out and kill people for the simple reason that you don't.
Can you define neo-nihilism? I have my own understanding of the term, but just
Yeah.
briefly.
Well, neo-nihilism is an essay I wrote a few years ago, and it's actually inspired a new Marvel philosopher superhero called Karnak through the writer Warren Ellis, bizarrely. But it's a chapter in my book Numinautics, then, and it's the view that, well, pretty much what I was saying. There is no absolute ideal, and I've called it neo-nihilism because nihilism has a number of meanings. It doesn't mean that there's no truth necessarily. That's some forms of nihilism. And it does emphasize the fact that we all have subjective values. You know, values absolutely exist. They're part, from Whiteheadian perspective, they're part of reality. Perception itself is valuation. You know, we've evolved to perceive what is of value to us. That's why we don't perceive X-rays, for example, because in our evolutionary past, they just didn't have any value. But other organisms in different parts of the universe perhaps do, because it was valuable to them directly, I mean. So neo-nihilism is the view that, yeah, there's no absolute objective form of morality, but there are subjective forms, and you can still strive to change the world according to those subjective values that you have and perhaps share with many people. But the ultimate point is you can't say that's an objective value, you know? You can't say people ought to follow what you say. That's never justified. So
okay, well, as I said, I did say to you offline that a lot of Buddhist crossover right there, but there's no need to highlight that. I think people who understand Buddhism and Taoism would certainly be able to intuit that themselves. But I certainly think your language is a little more Western inclined, and frankly, it's equally relevant as as you said, not to imply one or the other.
Yeah, well, I don't know much about Buddhism, I'm afraid. I've read Timothy, no, what's he called? Buddhism, The Religion of No Buddhism by Alan Watts. Yeah, that's right. So,
Right.
a very
Yeah.
Western perspective on Buddhism itself. But yeah, no, it sounds to me like there's a lot of crossover there. Yeah. So, and Schopenhauer, by the way, who was in a way a precursor to Nietzsche, is known in philosophy at least as this bridge between the East and the West. So he had the Upanishads, the Hindu Upanishads, below his pillow every night, and in later life he got into Buddhism apparently. And so that's probably why you've got a lot of time for, I imagine, Kant and Schopenhauer because of that overlap.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to let go there because I don't want to keep people on too long. But I'd like to have you back on again sometime. I'm going to just get another couple of guests in between you and me, if that's all right. And I don't want to take up too much of your time either, frankly. But I think there's so much more to explore there, frankly. We didn't get too much into the psychedelics. I like this idea of you kind of building a social platform, trying to reappraise the psychedelic use in the intellectual sphere for artistic purposes and creative purposes. I mean, we hear so much talk at the moment from the likes of Rick Doblin from Mapsons and at the John Hopkins University and so forth, talking about this for medicinal use. Likewise with marijuana, you can't use the word marijuana without applying the word medical these days. It's all medical marijuana this, medical marijuana this. But what about creativity? Why can't we talk about marijuana for creative purposes? Why can't we talk about psychedelics for creative purposes? We need to bring that paradigm on stage and have people talking about it openly. At the moment, you can talk about MDMA assisted psychotherapy, but you can't talk about MDMA for creating art, and that seems a little unfair as far as I'm concerned. Likewise with magic mushrooms, again, depression, addiction therapy, etc. But what about just getting loaded just to have some crazy ideas?
You're quite right. I'm getting a bit sick and tired of hearing about medical uses of
you follow
because
me.
I understand this is the process it needs to go through. First of all, you get sort of people accepting that, okay, if it's for medical purposes, okay. But this is, for me, this is the negative value of it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's I'm on the same page as you. I think that spirituality by stealth and all that. I appreciate that. We're going to try and sneak it in the back door as a medical purpose, and then we'll go from there. But why wait? I only intend to live to 1,000, so I want to try and see this thing in the next few years. I'll maybe have it back and we might maybe dissect that a little bit more and maybe get into some of the kind of more just maybe we can look this, as I said, there's so much more to go. Even there are aspects of the book there that we have just touched on that I wanted to kind of dig a little deeper and it just didn't seem appropriate necessarily. But there's a hell of a lot more to deal with there.
Well, I'd be happy to come back. So
yeah, and I think the process is I'm going to have to kind of get my head around that a little bit more. I think it's Taoism is more my kind of intellectual forte, and I think it's very much the same thing, frankly. But I don't want to start comparing without having a little more understanding of it. But I think it probably is the same thing in essence. So I want to look at that as well.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, on my website, philosopher.eu, there's an introduction to Whitehead and his process philosophy and some Bergson there, so that might help. If I get a chance to look into Taoism, then perhaps we can have more of a chat about.
Yeah.
if I have time.
Well, listen, do you want to shout out your platform to people who want to look at your work, whatever, wherever you're available, and what you're doing? Incidentally, the book, by the way, is available from Psychedelic Press, and you can buy that on Amazon, I'm sure, and everything else. You can buy it anywhere, presumably.
Yeah,
Psychedelic Press, by the way, if anybody doesn't know them, they have got a very, very rich library of production. So, if you don't know them, you certainly will get to know them.
yeah. No.
So you want to shout out your platform? Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I mentioned, my personal website is www.philosopher.eu. It's got a number of texts by me and other people as well, some videos and yeah, this and that. I'm also on Facebook on Ontologistics, and Twitter, I think it's Peter Sjöstedt-H, which is spelled Peter Sjösteddth. It's a Swedish name. My mother's Swedish, my father's British. And yeah, I've got a YouTube channel. It's all linked on my website, yeah. And yeah, the book's Numernautics. Preferably buy it from the publisher, Psychedelic Press, as you say. It's available on Amazon, I think, but the publisher gets less of a cut from that, so ideally avoid it.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I'm
good.
based at Exeter University doing my PhD there in panpsychism, as I say. Yeah, so I think that covers all the bases.
That sounds fantastic. Well, listen, again, thanks for coming on, and maybe stay on the air briefly afterwards. I have a quick 2 minutes with you. And as I said, it's been a really, really insightful talk, and one which, as I said, I think there's a lot more in that we could tackle. So I'm going to, as I said, look up a few of those ideas there and see if I can kind of get my head around them a little bit deeper. But I certainly seem to very much gel with everything you've said.
Excellent.
And as I said, I think it's very important that we do push this agenda forward of psychedelics for creativity and not just for medicinal purposes, although that is very important too. It certainly isn't exclusive, and they certainly aren't mutually exclusive.
Agreed. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.